In this video, we'll have an overview of muscle tissue. So this is just a bit of an introduction for us. And of course, we know from our histology chapter that there are different types of muscle tissue. We have cardiac, skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. And of course, the job of all these types of muscle tissue is to generate a force. Remember, muscle can only pull, it can't push. Now, there's other functions when it comes to muscle tissue. Of course, by generating this force, we can create movement. We also help to maintain posture. Often we think muscles are always about movement, but they also have a big role in postural stabilization. So they stabilize joints, like fixators, such as the scapula muscles will fixate or hold the scapula, so things like the biceps brachii can do its work without rotating the scapula out of position. Also generate heat. A lot of our body heat comes from muscles as a byproduct, and basically helps to regulate the flow of materials through hollow organs. So we have a number of functions that we can see. Now we're really going to focus in on skeletal muscle, striated tissue. And when we're looking at skeletal muscle tissue, we're looking at long, multinucleated cells that are stacked parallel to each other, arranged parallel to each other. And they extend nearly the entire length of the muscle. Now, typically, we don't call them muscle cells. Sure. But typically we call them fibers because of the length and the appearance, and also because of some embryological origins of them. Now, contractions we tend to think as voluntary, so under conscious control. Yes, that's true for most of them, but some of the muscles, which are basically a skeletal muscle we use for respiration, they are mostly involuntary. Otherwise, we'd have to think about every breath. So, yeah, there's a little fine line between that, most of them being voluntary, but under certain circumstances, certain muscles almost act like an involuntary because it's not conscious control. And of course, they're attached to the skeleton by connective tissue, which would be the tendons, which we talked a bit about in previous chapters. All right, so when we're looking at types of muscles, here we can see a diagram of a typical skeletal muscle. Yes, they're arranged in these bundles. You can see that they're multinucleated, and you can see the striations. And of course, mostly attached to the skeleton. There are some that are attached to soft tissues. They tend to be, infrequent, and the rare ones we tend to think about involuntary, and of course, they produce movement. Now, just a reminder, since we are talking muscle, we should say something about the other ones, which we have mentioned before, is cardiac muscle, of course, only found in the heart, and it's short, it's branched, 1 to 2 nuclei, and one of the key features are the intercalated discs that help to join the adjoining cells to bring them together. And these intercalated discs are a place where we see gap junctions and desmosomes. And the desmosomes help to hold the cells together because, of course, if your heart, all these heart cells are beating and contracting, you don't want them to shred and rip apart from each other. So I really have to make sure they're really well attached by desmosomes, and the gap junctions allow the electrical signal to go from one heart cell to the next. And this allows for a coordinated contraction. And of course, we'll talk more about this when we get to the heart chapter. And the contraction is involuntary. And here's just a little summary. Have a look at it. It's basically what we've said before. Now, smooth muscle, no striations. We do not see visible striations under the microscope. And they have a different arrangement of the cells. They're long, they're flat with pointed ends, spindle-shaped. And they have a single centrally located nucleus. Now, where do we find these? This is really involuntary. So we find them lining hollow organs, lining certain walls of the GI tract, making up some of the layers of blood vessels, things like that. And depends on what type of smooth muscle we're looking at, but they're linked by gap junctions, and that allows for a synchronous contraction. Okay, so a nice thing, once again, about your textbook is it does have these great summaries. So you go through, you read the material, you get the gist of it, you get the details, and then these summaries are a great way to sort of refresh your memory, to do a comparison of the three different types on one sheet. So make sure you make use of these resources that are in your textbook. Okay, what are some of the properties of muscle cells? Well, they have the ability to contract. That is their main reason for existing. So they do it by having proteins that can grab within a cell. The proteins can grab on and pull themselves by each other, which we're going to see as the sliding filament theory. All right. Now, excitability is the ability to respond to a stimulus. So that's either chemical, mechanical stretch, or a local electrical signal. And conductivity, they are able to conduct electrical charges across their plasma membrane. Once we get into the electrophysiology of muscles, like skeletal muscle, you really see there's a lot of comparisons between how their membranes will allow electrical charge to sweep over it with what we saw in neurons and action potentials. The other thing they have is extensibility. They have the ability to be stretched, sometimes up to 3 times their resting length without doing any damage, which is pretty amazing. And elasticity, because of course, if you were to stretch a muscle cell, it would be a one-hit wonder. You want it to go back to its original shape, so it has to have elasticity that allows it to return to its original length after stretching. Okay, so that was just a quick introduction. In the next video, we're going to come back and look at the actual structure of a muscle cell.